Hi, thank you for joining me. My name is Mindy Mandell, and this video is part of a series of videos on Proclus's Elements of Theology. In this video, I'm going to be introducing propositions 70 through 74. Throughout this series, I've been using the E.R. Dodds translation, and for those of you who don't have the book, there is a link in the description box that will lead you to a PDF version of the text. So we'll start with Proposition 70, which reads, all those more universal characters which inhere in the originative principles both irradiate their participants before the specific characters and are slower to withdraw from a being which has once shared in them. Now, if this sounds familiar, it's because we saw something very much like this back in Proposition 57. And this is the proposition that reads, every cause both operates prior to its consequent and gives rise to a greater number of posterior terms. And this proposition includes a corollary which explains that intelligence operates prior to soul, and the good operates prior to the intellect. From this corollary, then, we get an image something like this. And so I showed a screen like this back when I introduced Proposition 57. And it might be helpful to keep this in mind as we go through Proposition 70. So coming back to our text, let's take a look at how Proclus explains this one. He says that the higher cause begins its operation upon secondary beings before its consequent, and it is present concomitantly or together with the presence of the latter, with the consequent. And it is still present and operative even when the consequent has ceased to operate. And he says that this is true not only in respect of the range of objects affected, which was the focus of Proposition 57, but also in regard to each several contingent participant. And so now he's going to give us an example. And so here's his example. He says a thing must exist before it has life, and have life before it is human. And again, when the logical faculty has failed, it is no longer human, but it is still a living thing since it breathes and feels. And when life in turn has abandoned it, existence remains to it, for even when it ceases to live, it still has being. And so in every case. I'm going to pause here for a moment because I think that this is a difficult example. I know I've struggled with it, and I imagine other people do as well. I think that there's some trouble with the phrasing to say when the logical faculty has failed, it is no longer human. This is not to say that older person with dementia, for example, is no longer human. But I think he's just simply saying that the logical faculty, which is the mark of being human, falls away first. And there's still that aspect of the soul that gives us life and breath that remains longer. And even when this leaves the body, matter remains the longest. And so he's showing that progression here. And he says that the reason for this is that the higher cause, being more efficacious, operates sooner upon the participant. For where the same thing is affected by two causes, it is affected first by the more powerful. And in the activity of the secondary, the higher is cooperative because all the effects of the secondary are concomitantly generated by the more determinative cause. And where the former has withdrawn, the latter is still present. For the gift of the more powerful principle is slower to abandon the participant, being more efficacious, and also inasmuch as through the gift of its consequent, it has made its own irradiation stronger. So these are the three causes that Proclus was focusing on here. With existence being the most powerful, it's the one that comes first and the one that falls away last. Then there's the life force in the middle and the logical faculty, which is the third and the one that will fall away first, and the life force will remain. And then when that falls away, still the existence or the body will still remain. So this basic pattern, if you will, of the order in which principles give their gifts and I wouldn't want to say take them away, but where they no longer are functioning. This is what we're going to see unfolding as we go through all the different propositions today. As we go on to Proposition 71, we're going to see that this one is building on Proposition 70. Proposition 71 is showing that the higher terms are more general and the latter terms are more specific. So this one is very long, but let's go through it together. It reads, all those characters which in the originative causes have higher and more universal rank become in the resultant beings through the irradiations which proceed from them a kind of substratum for the gifts of the more specific principles. And while the irradiations of the superior principles thus serve as a basis, the characters which proceed from secondary principles are founded upon them. There is thus an order of precedence in participation, and successive rays strike downwards upon the same recipient, the more universal causes affecting it first, and the more specific supplementing these by the bestowal of their gifts upon the participants. Okay, that was one of the longer ones that we're going to see in this book. And you can see that the explanation of it is quite short. And so we're seeing there that there is a specific order then in the precedence of participation. He goes on to say, if the more determinative causes operate before the secondary, which is what was argued in Proposition 70, being present through their superfluity of power, even to things which have less perfect capacity of reception, and irradiating even these, whereas causes that are subordinate in rank confer their gifts later, then it is plain that the irradiations of the superior causes, being the first to occupy the common participant, serve as a support to the bestowals of their subordinates, which use these irradiations as a foundation, and that's key, and act upon a participant prepared for them by the more general principles. And that is key because what he's arguing here is that not only does the general precede the specific, but it also creates a kind of foundation or base for the specific to build on. And so, for example, the body must exist before it can participate life, and life must be present for a being to enjoy the rational faculty, and so on. We saw some of this in Proposition 70. We see it more clearly here. And this idea is going to be developed even further in Proposition 72. Proposition 72. All those characters which in the participants have the relative position of a basis, that's what was referred to in Proposition 71, and all of those characters proceed from more complete and more universal causes. So back in Proposition 71, Proclus showed that the more complete causes bestow more universal characteristics, which function as a foundation for more specific characteristics. Now in 72, he's saying that these foundational characteristics proceed from more complete and universal causes. So in 71, he focused on the causes, and in 72 here, he's looking at those foundational characteristics and saying that they must be proceeding from more complete and universal causes. So Proclus has just turned it around. Now, as we look at how he makes this case here, we see here that he's going to make a reference to Proposition 60. Proposition 60, just for a quick review, reads, whatever principle is the cause of a greater number of effects is superior to that which has a power limited to fewer objects, and which gives rise to parts of those existences, so more specific characteristics. It gives rise to parts of those existences that are constituted by the other as wholes. So the wholes then would be the more general characteristics. And so Proposition 60 was really laying the basis for what we're looking at today. Proposition 60 then arguing that the more general characteristics come from causes that are more powerful and give rise to a greater number of effects. So jumping back now to Proposition 72, let's see how Proclus makes his case. He says the cause of more numerous effects is more powerful and universal and nearer to the one than the cause of fewer. And the principles which bring into existence the prerequisite foundations for other gifts are causes of more effects, since they generate even the receptivity which is a condition of the presence of the specific forms. These characters, therefore, are as they exist in the causes more universal and more complete than the rest. Now, to understand what Proclus is saying here, there's something very curious that we need to focus on here. He says that these higher principles bring into existence the prerequisite foundations for other gifts. And the way they do this is they generate even the receptivity, which is the condition for the presence of the more specific forms. And so we've seen in the past with Proposition 56 or 7, somewhere around there was the idea that higher causes give to their subsequents the power to, in turn, function as causes in their own right. They give that power to function as a cause. But now we're seeing from the other end that they also give the recipients the power to function as recipients. And let's jump to the corollary to see if maybe we can get a more specific example and see this in a more concrete way. So this reads, from this it is apparent why matter, taking its origin from the one, is in itself devoid of form, and why body, even though it participates being, is in itself without participation in soul. For matter, which is the basis of all things, proceeds from the cause of all things, and body, which is the basis of ensouled existence, is derived from a principle more universal than soul, in that after its fashion it participates being. And so we might envision something like this, where the higher reaches lower, extends further, and it also creates a kind of foundation on which then the later levels can build on. And so at the top you have a downward building, if you will, from the one to being to soul. But from the bottom there's a building up, a foundation from matter to body to soul. And so we're seeing that this same basic principle about power creates what seems paradoxical to many, that matter, body, would extend farther than soul, which seems to be the more powerful. But now we're seeing why that is so. Okay, going on to Proposition 73, this one reads, every whole is at the same time an existent thing and participates being, but not every existent is a whole. For either existent and whole mean the same thing, or one of these terms is prior to the other. So what we see here is that we're putting these terms in order. And I think you would find it helpful to keep in mind Proposition 67. This was what initiated that whole discussion about whole before the parts, whole of parts, or a whole in the part. And in opening up this discussion, we came up then with this diagram to show the ordering going clockwise, where the whole before the parts, the transcendent whole, was at the summit, the whole of parts, where the whole is immanent within the parts, with the parts together, and then the whole in the part, so the part is participating wholeness. And that was the progression, that we saw before. We want to keep this in mind as we take a look at what he's going to do with being and whole. And when we add Proposition 74, we'll have another triad. Okay, so with all of that in mind, let's take a look at what Proclus did here. He says that even if the part qua part isn't existent, for a whole must be composed of existent parts, although it is not itself a whole, then existent and whole cannot be identical. For this would make the part non-existent, and thereby the whole also, since every whole is a whole of parts, either as prior to them or as immanent in them. And that's what we saw in Proposition 67. And if the part do not exist, then neither can the whole, right? Put together a bunch of non-existent parts, and boom, you made a whole that doesn't exist. Congratulations. And if wholeness be prior to being, then all that exists will immediately be a whole, and thus again the part will not exist as a part. And as a part is key, meaning by definition of what a part is. But this is impossible, for if the whole is a whole because it includes a part, so also a part will be a part because it belongs to a whole. By exclusion, then, every whole is existent, but not every existent is a whole. And so that was a rather long-winded way of saying that parts exist, which seems pretty obvious, so we have to wonder why he's doing this. And it becomes very clear in the corollary that here he is putting these terms in their metaphysical order. And the corollary reads, "From this it is apparent that primal being is beyond wholeness, inasmuch as the former is present to a greater number of participants, since existence is predicable even of parts qua parts, and the latter to fewer, for the cause of more effects is superior, that of fewer is inferior, as has been shown in Proposition 60. And so Proposition 60 is key to this way of ordering the terms. The cause of more effects is superior, and that of fewer effects is inferior. And this brings us to Proposition 74, which will round out our triad. Every specific form is a whole, as being composed of a number of individuals, each of which goes to make up the form. But not every whole is a specific form. For even the atomic individual is a whole as being atomic, although it is not a form. This language is a little bit confusing. What he's saying here is that a particular component is both a whole and an individual, although not necessarily a form. Since anything is a whole which is composed of parts, but a form is that which is actually divided into a plurality of individuals. What this means here is that by the time you reach the level of form, you're dealing with that which is differentiated, whereas the whole of parts is not yet differentiated. Wholeness and form are therefore mutually distinct, and the former is the more extensive predicate. Accordingly, wholeness is above the forms of being. And again, he cites Proposition 60, which is the one that we looked at just a few moments ago. And so when we put this together with Proposition 73, we see that we have a new triad of being, wholeness, and form. And that's what the corollary here is pointing out. From this, it is apparent that wholeness occupies a mean station between being and the forms. It follows that being is prior also to the forms, and that the forms are existent things, but not every existent is a form. Hence, in the resultants, privations are in some sense existent, although they are not forms. For through the unitary power of being, they too have received some feeble irradiation of existence. And so we can make a new triad of being, wholeness, and form. And we want to still keep in mind our previous triad of whole before the parts, whole of parts, and whole in the part. And if we're understanding his explanations of 73 and 74, we see that we can actually put them together. That being is the whole before the parts, it's the transcendent unified, it's the unity of that triad. Whereas the whole of parts is the wholeness that is still prior to differentiation, but the parts and the whole are together. By the time you get to the level of form, the whole in the part, now it is differentiated. And so that's the triad that he's creating here. I do hope you found that helpful. Please let me know in the comments section below what difficulties you might be having or what insights you've had. And as always, I do thank you for watching, and I hope you will join me next time.